Action potentials are electrical signals traveling along the axon of a neuron. They integrate, send, and receive information in the nervous system, generated through changes in membrane potentials along the axon. These changes are produced by changes in the membrane's permeability to ions and alterations of ion concentrations across the membrane. Two types of signals can be produced when the membrane potential changes: graded potentials and action potentials. Graded potentials are small deviations from the membrane potential that decrease in intensity with distance. The current generated is quickly dissipated due to the leaky plasma membrane and can only travel over short distances. Their magnitude varies directly with the strength of the stimulus. Graded potentials can summate or even cancel out each other. Sufficiently strong graded potentials can initiate action potentials. Changes in the membrane potential could result in three events: depolarization, repolarization, and hyperpolarization. Depolarization occurs when the inside of the membrane becomes less negative. Repolarization occurs when the membrane returns to its resting membrane potential. Hyperpolarization occurs when the inside of the membrane becomes more negative than the resting potential. The potential difference across the membrane of a resting neuron is about -70 millivolts. It is generated by different concentrations of sodium, potassium, chlorides, and protein anions. Ionic differences are the consequence of differential permeability of the membrane to sodium and potassium, and also the operations of the sodium-potassium pump. The membrane is more permeable at rest to potassium, so more potassium diffuses out of the cell than sodium diffuses in. On the other hand, the sodium-potassium pump moves 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions into the cell, creating concentration gradients. Thus, more positive charges leave the cell than enter, leaving behind many negatively charged ions and proteins, and making the inside of the cell more negative than the outside. An action potential is a brief reversal of the membrane potential, with a total amplitude of about 100 millivolts. Action potentials are only generated by muscle cells and neurons. They do not increase in strength over distance. An action potential in the axon of a neuron is called a nerve impulse. At the resting stage, the sodium and potassium voltage-gated channels are closed. When the stimulus is received by the dendrites of a nerve cell, it causes the sodium channels to open. If the opening is sufficient to drive the interior potential from -70 millivolts up to -55 millivolts, the process continues. Having reached the action threshold, more sodium voltage-gated channels open. The sodium influx drives the interior of the cell membrane up to 30 millivolts. This process is called depolarization. During repolarization, the sodium channels close and the potassium channels open. Since the potassium channels are much slower to open, the depolarization has time to be completed. Having both sodium and potassium channels open at the same time would drive the system towards neutrality and prevent the creation of the action potential. With the potassium channels open, potassium exits the cell, and internal negativity of the resting neuron is restored. The repolarization typically overshoots the resting potential to about -90 millivolts. This is called hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization prevents the neuron from receiving another stimulus during this time, or at least raises the threshold for any new stimulus. Hyperpolarization ensures that the signal proceeds in one direction. Repolarization restores the resting electrical conditions of the neuron, but does not restore the resting ionic conditions. After hyperpolarization, the sodium-potassium pump eventually brings the membrane back to its resting stage of -70 millivolts and restores the resting ionic conditions. The law of all or none is the principle that the strength by which a nerve or muscle fiber responds to a stimulus is not dependent on the strength of the stimulus. If the stimulus is any strength above the threshold, the nerve or muscle fiber will give a complete response, or otherwise no response at all. Note that the amplitude of an action potential is always the same. The intensity of a stimulus is not reflected by the amplitude of the action potential, but by the frequency of the action potential. Each sodium channel has 2 voltage-regulated gates, the activation gate and the inactivation gate. The time from the opening of the sodium activation gates until the closing of the inactivation gates is the absolute refractory period. The absolute refractory period prevents the neuron from generating an action potential, ensures that each action potential is separate, and enforces a one-way transmission of nerve impulses. The interval following the absolute refractory period is the relative refractory period. It takes about 3 to 4 milliseconds for all sodium channels to come out of inactivation in order to be ready for activation opening again. During this period, the threshold level is elevated, allowing strong stimuli to increase the frequency of action potential events. Now that we know how an action potential is generated, let's look at how it propagates along the axon. In response to a signal, the soma end of the axon becomes depolarized. The depolarization spreads down the axon. Meanwhile, the first part of the membrane repolarizes because sodium channels are inactivated and additional potassium channels have opened. The membrane cannot depolarize again. The action potential continues to travel down the axon. The conduction velocities vary widely among neurons. The rate of impulse propagation is determined by the axon diameter and the presence of a myelin sheath. The larger the diameter of an axon, the faster the impulse. The presence of a myelin sheath dramatically increases impulse speed. The uninsulated nodes of Ranvier are the only places along the axon where ions are exchanged across the axon membrane, regenerating the action potential between regions of the axon that are insulated by myelin. The propagation of impulse from one node of Ranvier to an adjacent node along the axon is called saltatory conduction. The largest and most heavily myelinated fibers conduct quickly, for example, to convey motor, touch, and proprioceptive impulses. If you like this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe to my channel to see more videos in future. Thank you for watching. Bye.